Welcome to the People's Forum.
We are demanding recoupment. Recoupment of our birthright with compound interest over the years of oppression and exploitation. We're demanding recoupment of earnings that were never paid. The initial demand of this recoupment is, as a start, $6 billion. $6 billion for the creation of a black urban coalition.
Welcome back, America. I'm your host, Kwame Innis. We've got a spitfire show for you today. What you just saw was Roy Innis, the former or chairman emeritus of the Congress of Racial Equality. And I'm very fortunate today to have the current chairman of Congress of Racial Equality on the phone, my brother Niger Innis. Niger, say hello.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
All right. Also on Skype, we have Goddess Aayanna. Say hello, Aayanna.
Peace, family.
Okay, in studio to my left, Hakeem.
How you doing? How you doing?
Okay, in center, Mr. Al Taylor.
How you doing, brother?
All right, today, as usual, this entire season, we've had on the table reparations for or against. Does America owe the ADOS population, American descendants of, I say, enslaved persons? Does America owe us a debt? Is there something to be paid for the 250 years in the so-called slavery and the other 100+ years of Jim Crow? What does America owe us specifically as a people? Unemotionally, just talking strictly to numbers. I'm going to throw this out to our new guest, Mr. Taylor.
How you doing, brother?
Please speak on that.
A number. That's funny. In researching it, I know that when they had broke it down at one point, they had come up with a $150,000 number. The reality to me is that if you expect reparations to come in the form of a check or in the form of money that's going to be handed to individuals, and now to say, okay, because slavery happened and because these things happened, here's a piece of the pie for you. What's going to happen with that money? What is that money supposed to really symbolize in today's time?
Let's not get ahead of ourselves with the check. First, let's deal with whether or not everyone that's part of this panel believes that African Americans are due reparations.
Some sort
well, in one form or another. We'll deal with what it's kind of the form it comes in, but whether or not just as a idea it makes sense. So I want to pass that around. You speak on it. Pass it to Hakeem. Pass it to the Goddess, and then lastly, pass it to Niger.
Okay. Some sort of recognition for the fact that we went through it, yes, but I would never look at it to say that it would have to have some sort of monetary value of a reparation. I mean, I would say that some sort of acknowledgement of what occurred, to say we understand that your culture has been basically hindered because of it. So therefore, training, education, some form of that, yes. But never in the form of, okay, when the minute you say reparations, most people think, oh, money, a check, or.
I think they feel that way because it's happened in the past. There's at least 5 groups that have received it in the past, and I can name 3 that are currently receiving it quite often. So I mean, I don't want to jump in on Hakeem.
I think it goes without question. I think that it's clear and obvious what happened. For us to really put a quantitative value on it, I think we've also discussed it before. There really isn't a way to do it. I mean, but is it owed? Of course.
Well, you say there's no way to do it. I'm going to have to argue the fact that we have a distinguished gentleman, Mr. Sean Rochester, who was on the show, wrote a book called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America, where this University of Chicago MBA actually does quantify it and does put a dollar to it. Dr. Sandy Darity, Duke economist, puts a dollar figure to it. Our fraternity brother, Derek Hamilton, New School professor, they put a dollar to it. There are men and women from all cultures that are extremely adept, extremely qualified and researched, and they can put a dollar figure to this thing. What do you say, Goddess Aayanna?
While the monetary system still exists, I think that we absolutely are owed a monetary debt. But I think that we all are aware that America with 3 Ks owes us much more than finances and material debt.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's, worded perfectly. I don't know, the different areas in which we were affected. Is there a number that we can place on that?
Well, I'd like to say this because I've been researching and doing some reading of Dr. Darity's plan, and it's just not money. There's an entire spectrum that he covers. He covers monetarily, educationally, politically, land, agriculturally. They cover everything, but no one takes the time to actually read it, or no one even wants to hear the argument. Nigel, we have you on the phone. You want to jump in?
Well, let me refer to my predecessor as chairman of the Congress of Racial Equality, our father, Kwame, Roy Innis, who in the late 1960s, early 1970s, proposed a specific figure of $6 billion, what he called recoupment. And for history's sake, we should note that he was the first black leader of a major civil rights organization to propose such an idea. In fact, he was alone in isolation with other black leadership. The NAACP did not initially embrace this. The Black Congressional Caucus did not initially embrace this, as small as it was back then. He was the first mainstream civil rights leader to propose recoupment in the 1960s. Now, if you adjust for inflation, that $6 billion figure is today roughly, and actually let's inflate it to a round number of $10 billion. That would be $53 billion. But I think if Roy Innis were doing the show today, he would say it's very important for us to look at context and time. A lot of people presume that Roy Innis changed over the years. What he would say is that he didn't change. He lived a Garveyite and he died a Garveyite. But what has changed, and what he, as a pragmatist, recognized, was that America had changed. He would not have viewed the possibility of America elevating a black man, a pure black man named Clarence Thomas, to the highest court in the land. He would not have assumed back then that there would have been the tremendous amount of political, social, and economic uplift that has taken place within black America. And he would not have presumed the large amount of money and programs that have been spent disproportionately on black Americans over the last 40 to 50 years. So I believe that Roy Innis would say, of course, those slaves that worked for free and were abused and persecuted, that their direct descendants are entitled to some type of recognition and perhaps even a qualitative reparations. But I suspect he would want a grand bargain, if you will, that would say, yes, the direct descendants specifically would be entitled to some recognition and perhaps monetary value, but we have to bring into the calculation the amount of money that have been spent on, such as war on poverty programs. Estimated $22 trillion has been spent on the war on poverty since the 1960s. That affirmative action programs, government contracting, et cetera, all these things will be part of that calculation.
Okay.
And at
Nigel, can I stop you for a second? Because
yeah.
I mean, you're talented. You're talented, and I knew Roy Innis well. And I want to put this thing in context. And putting it in context, I want to start with our esteemed Justice Clarence Thomas. That Roy Innis would have had a name for him, and it probably came from the pig, meaning a pork chop. He would have called him a gatekeeper, and he would have said quite frankly and plainly that the reason Clarence Thomas could be on the court is strictly because of his politics, not because of his neutral nature in voting anything for African Americans. That's point number one. Point number two, keep it in context. Affirmative action, if we look at the statistics, has it helped ADOS or has it helped everyone? And that's our problem. Every time we get to a question about the African American ADOS population, we get into the all lives, everybody. Let's do something for all the poor. The problem is when you deal with generational wealth and the wealth gap and where we are, Black Americans, African Americans, ADOS are at the bottom in every statistical category that matters except HIV, going to prison, and getting murdered. And that's not because they're born inherently stupid. There's a hand that's moving around here. I don't want to take over the conversation, but I want to mention that. You cannot say that affirmative action was for Black people, because that's just absolutely, positively not true.
Can I respond?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I absolutely, you're absolutely correct. There's no doubt that affirmative action, in fact, you can argue that the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action has been white females.
And
I do not push back against that notion. But what I will
secondly,
say, though, is that
secondly, non-ADOS people who are coming to America newly from whether the Caribbean, whether from the continent of Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, have been taking advantage of the status, and American Blacks have not. So we don't want to, don't lay that on our shoulders.
I couldn't agree with you more. And and by the way, I totally disagree with you on your analysis of Roy Innis and Justice Clarence Thomas, particularly since it was Roy Innis, in the early 1990s and late 1980s, when Clarence Thomas was on a lower federal court, was fully supportive, 110% supportive of Justice Clarence Thomas in the 80s and in the 90s, and fought for him to get on the Supreme Court. But we can argue that another time.
But you and I were at that convention when Dad made the transition in terms of Democrat and Republican. You and I were there together, and I remember the words exactly. Kwame, Niger, I'm not necessarily pro-Republican or pro-Democrat. We just need to integrate both the parties so we're not held hostage by one and ignored by the other. Am I lying?
He was a pragmatist. He was a pragmatist when he died, and he was a pragmatist in 1969 as well. But let me get to the affirmative action thing and a lot of these poverty programs. A lot of them were inspired out of the Civil Rights Revolution led by Black Americans, and it came to fruition for Black Americans, but it was taken advantage of a variety of non-Black Americans. And I believe Roy Innis would be very skeptical of the reparations discussion because he would be fearful that yet again Black Americans' pain would be prostituted for somebody else's gain.
I totally agree. What we cannot do is allow other groups to jump in on the bandwagon. That's why this ADOS movement has been so specific. That's why when you listen to Dr. Tony Darity, when you listen to Tone Talks, when you listen to Yvette Carnell, when you listen to Philippe Matthews, when you listen to all of these people who are speaking about this, even when you listen to the Congresswoman that authored H.R. 40, they're speaking specifics. They're not talking in generalities. Go ahead, somebody else jump in.
Well, Sister Aayanna, what's your view, Sister Aayanna?
Sister Aayanna, can you hear us?
My views, of course, are that we're absolutely owed reparations, and we definitely need to keep ourselves separate from other people that would be trying to get our reparations. You know, we don't want any $5 blacks trying to, jump in and swoop up and get our reparations. African Americans that are descendants of the enslaved Africans that were stolen from Africa need to make sure that we are obtaining something exclusively for us, because exclusively it was us that was going through these horrendous acts of enslavement. And so with that, we should also make sure that we're focused on protecting ourselves if we were ever to receive the money. I think that a lot of people that have the idea that if you give blacks this money, it'll be gone in the white man's hands the next day is absolutely heinous. Although I do understand where that's coming from, I think there's enough self-aware African Americans here that would put the money to good use in instilling and installing institutions that would educate our children and educate our future generations on how to
Guys, let me jump in for a second. They're pushing me to go to a break. I'm going to let you pick up on that on the other side, and we're going to really investigate that part, because I don't think African Americans have to be worthy. So we're going to break right now. Coming back with you with more fire. We are back. We left off with the goddess Aayanna. I'm going to let her pick back up. We were talking about whether or not black people are worthy or educated enough or somehow have some sort of profound knowledge that's going to allow us to do the right thing with reparations. Goddess, please go ahead.
I mean, if you're a descendant of enslaved Africans, of course, we shouldn't have to prove our worth. Just being that is enough. But what I was just saying was basically that if we get the money, that we definitely need to make sure that we have protective forces, because it's not that black people are too ignorant and that we can't create the wealth for ourselves. It's that when we create the wealth, something happens. And, like Tulsa, Oklahoma, we get bombed. Something happens to hinder us, even on a physical level. We are in a war, absolutely. So that's my biggest thing, is that we would make sure that we're funding our protection and education.
Exactly. Can we go to image number 4? Niger, let me say something. America has had a structural system, a structural racism backed by our own government. And we know what these things are. I can go back to the 3/5 compromise. We've had structural things backed by our own government hindering black America and providing reparations and affirmative actions to other groups. New immigrants from Europe who were receiving land and receiving head rights and receiving all sorts of things You know, all they had to do was show up and be white. I mean, African Americans couldn't even be citizens until what was that year? 1955. I mean, so how do you compete with those things?
That's right. Look, again, I have no argument against justice being visited upon the direct descendants of those black Americans that suffered in slavery and in segregation. Now, what that is, what that quantitative monetary value is, in terms of a grand bargain, do you take into account the percentage of affirmative action, the percentage of the war on poverty, the percentage of government programs, contracts that went directly to African Americans and subtract that from whatever that monetary figure would be? I think that has to be a part of the legitimate discussion.
Has anybody ever subtracted anything from the American Indian? Has anybody ever subtracted anything from them? I've never heard anyone mention subtracting anything from an American Indian, an American Eskimo, a Japanese American. I've never heard anybody talk about the Jewish Americans paying anything back in terms of the aid or American lives lost fighting World War II. I never hear these arguments when it comes to any other group except for African Americans, and it's wholly unfair.
And if I could chime in, if you look at the cultural aspects of those groups that you just mentioned, they refuse within their culture to allow anyone to do that.
Okay.
The issue I have when you start talking about reparations for direct descendants of slaves, you have a whole group of blacks that were not slaves during the time.
Then this doesn't apply to them.
So, but then goes the factor. At what point in time do you look at the quote unquote direct? How does my great grandfather being a slave entitle me to money now?
Oh, I'm glad you said that, because if my great grandfather was a slave and he was allowed zero wealth until 1865, zero. And then after 1865, we got 11 years of Reconstruction, and then we got another 75 years of Jim Crow. Okay, and in which he's still allowed to accumulate, what, 1% of U.S. wealth? And then everything is everything from redlining to not being allowed in the military, to then, if you're in the military, only being allowed to work at certain posts, to whether it's where you could live, what you could buy.
These are all the things that were going on that allowed us to gain the fight to be able to conquer those things.
Oh,
to move
so
forward.
What does not kill us makes us stronger.
So now here we are now with
2% of U.S. wealth.
With
2%.
Okay. So at what time do we not continue to fight?
Who got reparations?
No, we should never stop fighting. Go ahead, Goddess.
White slave owners to get reparations, because to say that we don't need reparations just because our great-grandfathers and great-grandparents were enslaved, which a lot of us are still enslaved just to debt or in the jail systems. So is it okay for them to have gotten reparations and not the people who have built this country?
Because they received reparations. The white slave owners received reparations.
Based on
property loss, they called it. And you were not property. You were not 3/5 person. You were not property.
All of that.
They should never.
There's an opportunity loss.
They were traitors. They were traitors to this nation, and they should have been hung and shot.
So with that being said,
by the way, on that note, let me jump in here?
Yes.
Yeah. One of the interesting
Niger, 3 minutes to the end of the show. 3 minutes to the end of the show. I'm sorry. I just want you to know that.
All right, then I'm going to pivot to something else very quickly. I would welcome your watchers, your viewers, your guests to read the book Chancellor Williams' Destruction of Black Civilization, where he certainly holds Europeans accountable for the West African slave trade, but he also holds Arabs who were involved in the East African slave trade for 600 years.
Okay, we're not going to take the gaslighting and go down the red herring trail. We're not dealing with Arabs. We're dealing with the U.S. government, America. I tell you to tell people to read. Put number 12 up, please. Put number 12 up. I want people to read American Apartheid. You know, never mind Chancellor Williams talking about the Arabs. We're dealing with America. We live in America right now, and we're not chasing any red herrings. I'm sorry, Nigel, go ahead.
Yeah, I know there's not enough time to respond.
All right.
What I would say.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, what I would say very quickly is that it's very important for Black Americans to understand that the first experiment in globalization was called Black Gold. And it was not exclusively white people involved in that slave trade globally.
All of my enemies are my enemies, Nigel. The Arab enemies are my enemies, the European, the English, the Portuguese, the Spanish, they're all our enemies. And those 9 European nations that carved up Africa owe reparations to the entire world. We're only dealing here right now with ADOS, American descendants of slaves.
Listen.
That's why we're keeping it quantitative. Listen, gentlemen, 20 seconds, each of you please close out.
History would love to have us believe that the Europeans and so on and so forth were so ill and so bad of people, they were able to come onto the continent of Africa, snatch us off of Africa, bring us here and make us slaves. No, that had to come from both sides.
Okay.
It had to come from both sides.
So now we want to blame the African kings who sold us.
It had to come from both sides.
Hakeem, please, 20 seconds.
I think this is a very interesting conversation. I think it's pretty obvious. I don't know, you know, haven't we seen what's been happening on this planet for the past 500 years? I mean, there's lead in the water in Flint, and then they'll grade those kids and say they're slow. It's rigged, and you know, but I don't know how this whole reparation situation is going to be dealt with.
I'd like to give the last word to Sister Aayanna. You got 20 seconds, sis.
America is owed to African Americans, period. America itself is owed to us. We've been through too much, and we're owed too much. So anybody who doesn't believe that doesn't know history.
All right. I want to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank Niger Innis, Congress of Racial Equality. I'd like to thank Goddess Aayanna. I'd like to thank Hakeem, Al Taylor. Listen, this was a spirited, very emotional show. I really appreciate everybody coming on. Amen. I really appreciate all of the respectful dialogue, because it has to be always respectful. We have to have this dialogue, steel sharpens steel. I am unapologetically Black and about my people and about this struggle.
Yes.
And just because I'm willing to say we deserve reparations does not mean I'm not about the struggle, does not mean I don't hold myself to a very high standard and accountability for achievement. It says that somebody owes me something. In the words of Fences, it wasn't Denzel's own words, but it was the words of the playwright. They don't pay me because they like me, they pay me because they owe me. Good night, America. People's Forum. Good night.